But, capitalism is a very clever system. It has a million ways of adapting itself to make us think that this is okay. So, one of my favorite examples, I was part of the Occupy Wall Street protests in New York City way back. Soon after the protest began, it didn't take long for you to be able to buy Occupy t-shirts uptown in New York City, and Jay-Z had a special line of Occupy clothing. Capitalism appropriates the tools that are used against it. It realizes that people are starved of meaning, of agency. So it gives you the tools to think that you've got agency or meaning.
Hi, listeners. Welcome back to the Outside Context. We have a great episode coming up for you guys today. But first, Jana, what was your outside context moment this week?
So, my outside context has to do with history and the way that history is retorted at any point in time is basically, written by the winners and reframed to make those who are writing it look a bit better, really. So, my son is 9. He's a bit of a strange child. Our bedtime reading at the moment is currently the graphic novel version of Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*, which is a history of humankind. And it's a book that I read many, many years ago in its original form. We're reading the graphic novel, the graphic novel version, which is absolutely great, and I hugely recommend it. It's good for kids and really quite engaging for adults as well. But anyway, one of the interesting topics that it raises is, up till as recently as 30 to 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was not the only human species on the planet. We were, joined by a diverse range of other species from the Neanderthals across Europe and Asia, the Denisovans, further east, Homo floresiensis, the Flores Island Hobbit people, further down in what's modern day Indonesia. And anyway, abruptly, kind of most of them about 50,000 years ago, or 50,000 BC, some about 30,000 years ago, abruptly disappeared, leaving us as the dominant species on the planet. And there's a bit of a debate as to whether we assimilated these species, so we basically interbred with them and we therefore are them now, or whether we replaced them. And this could be a mixture of direct replacement, so we, did that human thing of hunting a native species to extinction, or also just we started consuming all of the resources and stuff like that. And anyway, it has been more recently found that in some human populations, in European and Asian populations, up to 6% of our DNA is actually, shared with Neanderthals. And other human populations in different parts of the world also show some signs of this genetic legacy. And this doesn't mean necessarily that we did fully assimilate them, just that some interbreeding happened at various points in time. But the interesting thing is that, sorry, that's the oven beeping in the background, the joys of recording from home. But anyway, the interesting thing here is that with the Neanderthals in particular, historically we've always treated them as this, brutish, unsophisticated species, not capable of the same, higher thinking as humans. Whereas now, since Europeans have discovered that they have some, genetic link to Neanderthals, the Neanderthals have undergone this massive rehabilitation, whereas, they're now capable of, art and culture, and having Neanderthal DNA as protection from certain diseases and things like that. And this is quite entertaining to me because it's very much, history being rewritten from the perception of someone who, doesn't want to be associated with the bad legacy that they once had, and now is rewriting it to fit their current worldview and their position in it.
Which, there are many, many examples that we could give of that happening in history before. But, it is really interesting, actually. One thing that this does tweak for me, and maybe you remember this too, is that this is evidenced actually in a lot of like religious texts as well, this kind of like multi-species ancient civilization. They mentioned kind of, I think is it the Nephilim and things like that in the Bible, and like other species that did not look the same as how we visualize humans today. And so it's interesting how that has been kind of carried through, and then obviously later evidenced by science, or not evidenced by science, which kind of leads me nicely into my outside context moment, which is, as some of you may have seen, for me personally, I sometimes hear random things that are strange and weird on the internet, as I'm sure many of you do. And many of you maybe will saw on like Twitter and X that there was this kind of fringe theory, quote unquote, discovery about some gigantic structures beneath the pyramids, which has not really been totally backed up by the scientific community. So I'm not going to dive into that too much. However, what I would say is it evidences a really interesting like human psychological phenomenon, is that we are really so keen to believe that there is something else going on in our history. And for those periods where we have these gaps and we look back, we want there to be a bigger explanation. We want there to be some sort of bigger picture, or we want there to be these mysteries unearthed. And, you could actually think about this in humans that hunted for things like Atlantis, or, they really wanted to have alchemists who wanted to have stones that turned things into gold, or, the chalice of eternal life. And these are reoccurring themes throughout human history that we just really, really want there to be this bigger explanation, even when it might not necessarily always be there, backed up and refuted. But I kind of love that about humans. And I don't know, I always also am curious about what happened to ancient civilizations. So I definitely fall a little bit susceptible into that trap myself. But I just think it's a really interesting psychological effect.
I think so too. It's that human need for there to always be something else, something more, and something we're missing. Like, no, the pyramids couldn't have possibly been built by humans. It must have been aliens. Surely that's the simplest explanation.
I mean, don't get me started on Stonehenge. We still don't know how those stones got there, but that's probably the topic for another day. Seriously, though, if there are any Stonehenge experts who would like to come on the podcast, please do slide into our DMs. But now, let's go to our episode.
So, Carne, welcome to The Outside Context. We're really excited to have you on the podcast today. During our prep call, we covered some super interesting topics, and we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the future of government. But first, start off by please, introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your background and your journey from your beginnings in the Foreign Office to founding International Diplomat and what you're doing today.
Sure. I was a British diplomat for 16 years, dealing with various things, including the Middle East. My last job was at the UK mission to the UN, dealing with Iraq, sanctions and weapons of mass destruction. That's why I'm no longer a British diplomat, because I resigned in 2004 after giving secret evidence to the first official inquiry into the war. And after that, I started a thing called Independent Diplomat, which is a non-profit diplomatic advisory group which advises democratic countries and political movements on diplomatic strategy all over the world, and is still going. I don't run it anymore. Somebody else runs it. I'm now freelance. My political journey is from a belief in the state to a belief in anarchism. So there's a potted biography for you.
Well, and I'm not sure. I think maybe some of our listeners know this, but probably not all. But I was super excited for this episode because in previous life, before I moved to the UK, I used to work at a think tank in the US doing counterterrorism research. And so I'm so excited to have this chance to talk about international politics and also current political trends. So maybe if you could tell us a bit more about, what you're doing now and how you see what's happening in the world impacting public confidence in democracies and like where the future of democracy is going.
Right. Well, I do various things. I'm setting up a network of commonalist, which is bottom-up democracy projects around the world. So that's one thing. I basically try to follow my politics, and I've reached an age where I don't really want to do anything other than pursue my beliefs in material form and that is a belief in self-government, in popular self-government participation. And the arc of my professional life has always been about whether in diplomacy or democracy that people should be part of the decisions about them. Nothing about us without us. That's, if there's one maxim my life has followed, it's that. Where is democracy going? Well, clearly it's in great trouble. I won't be the first to tell you that. Indices of the popularity of democracy are very clear that popularity is falling. Why that is, I think, is pretty clear. It's because of the failure of the economy to distribute wealth and income fairly to everybody. So a large proportion of society feel cheated. And at the same time, they are also excluded from the political system. A democracy that gives you one chance every 5 years to put a cross in a box does not equal to real agency or participation in the political decisions that really affect you. So people are denied economic agency, denied equality, but also denied political agency. And when that happens, they rise up against the system. And we're seeing that manifested in a number of different ways, mostly the rise of the far right.
I'm super interested in taking a step back and going back to your introduction and your journey from really being at the heart of diplomacy for one of the major Western democracies to um, to this change in your beliefs and your worldview. Can you talk us a little bit through your that journey and how your thought process changed and how that manifested in how you changed your career?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was a long journey. It wasn't just a sudden kind of change of heart. It started in disillusionment with the current system. I saw decent people lie to enable a war, an invasion, an illegal invasion of another country that killed 500,000 people. And it's hard to go through that and see that without becoming pretty disillusioned with the existing system. And aside from that, the indices of the system in terms of inequality, growing carbon concentrations in the atmosphere were also indicative of a system that was not working. So I began the search for a system that would work better. And I started with, what is it that people really want? Neoclassical economics assumes we want more stuff, that we, want to consume more material things. But that evidently is actually not the most important thing for people. And therefore, what would a system be like that actually promoted what is most important to people, including their own desire and freedom to decide that for themselves? It's not for me to say to people what it is they want, but neoclassical economists tell them the whole time what it is that they should want. I would prefer that people be free to express that desire freely in a liberated atmosphere. That to me is freedom, and from that freedom, where people are free to express what they truly are, will come stability.
And how can that actually be implemented from a practical perspective at a national level? Or are we talking about taking a step back and going down to a more kind of, government at a much more local level? Because that kind of more participatory democracy or participatory form of government, I guess, like works quite well in a country like Switzerland, which has the canton system, but also has a much smaller population as well, and has kind of, fewer major global, globally impacting decisions to make, I guess. How could we make that work in practice in a country like the UK, for example?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that it needs to work at the scale of the UK. I think countries are too big. I've worked on self-determination in all kinds of places, from Somaliland to the Western Sahara to Palestine, and I think we should have a lot smaller countries. It's absurd that one person, the Prime Minister in Britain or the President in the United States, has the power over so many people. But to answer your question, change comes from the bottom up, from people claiming agency by making decisions about the stuff that matters to them. And we work up from that level. It's got to be an individual change. It's got to be a collective change. It won't come about from people like me pontificating about it, or from, some revolutionary cadre who will introduce this change from the top down, as the communists believe change might be delivered. No, it has to come through individual acts of people taking agency over their own affairs. And then if you want to govern at scale, there's a very plausible system where you basically confederate the communal assemblies, which meet locally, to make larger scale decisions, whether it's a new road or a hospital, or if you want, defense policy. There are plausible ways of doing it.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that's really interesting because on previous episodes of the Outside Context, we've had discussions with people about, transformation of infrastructure, and also some conversations about data as well, and how it's really important in a more sustainable and, buildable tech future for all that people have control and agency over their data, which I think is linked to a lot of these things that you're saying with regards to self-determination. And I guess my question then is how are the technological changes we're seeing linked to that future that you see evolving, and how can tech impact that relationship between citizens and the state, either for good or for bad?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I don't think I have a clear answer to that. I don't think anybody has a clear answer to that. It can cut both ways. In Taiwan, somebody extraordinary called Audrey Tang is using technology to build participatory forms of democracy where large numbers of people can take part in decisions about their lives. So it's being used very positively there to enable mass participation in political decision making. But of course, the obverse is also true, that large capitalist profit-seeking companies are accumulating our data, have tweaked their systems, whether it's social media, or whatever, to capture as much of our data as possible, and are then exploiting that data. And the scary thing is that data is also being collected by governments in order to control us. And that applies to all governments. They want data, they want that information in order to see if we're threats to their system. And of course, the tools in their locker are now very, very powerful. I mean, you can now do an AI analysis of somebody's data, whether it's online or held in databases, extremely easily. The surveillance that is now possible of individual citizens is far, far more intrusive than anything we've seen in human history. And therefore, the mechanisms of control for governments are far greater. Now, most people in democracies trust their government with that data. I'm not sure I do. I mean, there are many, many instances of that information being abused. But if you have an authoritarian government, as we're seeing emerging in the US, then that danger is heightened, because they will use that information to target their opponents. And that's a very scary prospect.
And I guess maybe my follow on from this, and Jana, you probably have thoughts on this as well, though, is that it's not just the governments, and that broadly, one issue that I think that I see a lot, especially, I mean, for those of us that are in the kind of digital world, we talk a lot about data privacy and security and all of that, and control over your own data. The average person is probably not as concerned about that, and people are willing to share and give away quite a lot of data online through their usage of social media. And I think we couldn't have this conversation without talking about the other side of, the control of a lot of the tech that we see, which is the tech bro billionaire side of things. And I don't know, I guess I would just be interested in your views on that, because obviously they also have so much of our data, and for the most part, the general populace is like not that bothered about it, as far as I can tell.
I don't know. I mean, I can't tell if people are that bothered about it. You're absolutely right. I mean, people are willing to give away extraordinary amounts of their data. I do. What I shop, I open my computer and I'm amazed that it offers me, the pair of trousers I've been looking for. How does it know I'm looking for a pair of trousers? It's like this ghastly intelligent assistant, that's ever present in my life. It's like a spectre. And I find that basically really, really disturbing. And I think most people, when they think about it, that their emails, their social media posts, what they do online, shopping or posting on Facebook, is now held by corporate entities that are going to exploit that data, and also can be held by government to control them. And we trust these entities to protect our data, to do reasonable things with it, as we trust our governments. And I think that trust is misplaced. It's very clear that the tech bros are using technology to accumulate capital at fantastic rates, that these people are becoming richer beyond the wildest expectations of people even a few years ago, because of the network effects of technology, whether it's Amazon or social media. And they're becoming incredibly rich and therefore incredibly powerful. Money is power. We can only witness what Elon Musk is doing in America to see how his economic power is now translating into enormous political power. I mean, that translation always happened in that rich people, rich entities always had undue influence over government more than the ordinary person. But now it's overt, it's shameless. It's happening in an extraordinary manner. It's a very, very frightening time.
I think it's, that it's a really interesting topic that goes far beyond just who controls our data. It's really who controls the paradigms of government, really. For example, we're now seeing, these tech billionaires, these tech bros who are able to, ideologically influence the direction of government. And I guess there's a huge question there as to what extent can we say that we still live in democracies when they are so heavily influenced by both the combination of big money and big tech, and these huge ideological agendas.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. What is happening is it is becoming obvious what has always been the case, that capital controls government just as it exploits labor. Accumulations of capital those who accumulate capital have much greater political power than those who don't. And you can see the evidence in all kinds of different things. The way people are taxed. There isn't taxation for the super rich. The super rich are in some ways taxed less than the lowest paid. Why is that? Is it because governments think that that's better? No, it's because the super rich have more political influence. So this corruption of democracy is already very much more obvious than it was in the past. Maybe through that obviousness that will trigger at last some kind of reaction, because the mechanisms of capitalism are very good at making people comply, making us think that this is just normal, making us think that liberal democracy is the end of history, that it can't get better than this, that we can't change it. And maybe Trump and all the other awful right wingers are disrupting at least that complacency, and saying we are going to change it, but we're going to change it for the worst. And I hope that makes people wake up and see what is already happening to them. They don't really have democracy. Capitalism isn't really rewarding them. It is maintaining the vast majority in relative poverty, allowing a tiny few to get vastly rich. It's now becoming incredibly obvious what is going on, and surely that will trigger a kind of political reaction sooner or later. Or maybe it won't. Maybe we'll just go into some kind of supine, soporific sleep, endlessly watching Netflix blockbusters and playing video games.
I think
that is. Oh, go ahead, Jana.
no, I think there's some really interesting points in there. I guess while while money and wealth have always had influence in governments, I guess what you're saying is, with the advent of the tech billionaires, we're now seeing such concentrated wealth that is just obvious, due to the extreme that it's been taken. But also, I guess what people don't always take into account is that even in this concept of liberal democracy that we have, a lot of the choices, we have this illusion of choice in an election, but what we don't always realize is that a lot of the major choices have already been made through where donor money is directed, um,
Yeah,
through where, the influence of wealth, long before that election takes place. And now, of course, it's influencing that election as well by influencing and manipulating the way we think and the way we react through
yeah,
social media, and increasingly, how social media spills over into the mainstream media as well.
totally. I love the saying, whoever you vote for, they always win. Um, we're not really offered a political choice. We're offered slightly different versions of the current model. Nobody's offering radical alternatives, even though they can see what's wrong. What I find amazing is I think a lot of people are getting it in a way that they didn't 20 years ago, the years of Obama and Blair and Clinton and all of that. I think people thought liberal democracy and capitalism were just great. Everybody could get rich. And the financial crisis and what has happened since has made that very clear. Young people can't buy houses. They can barely afford rents in big cities or anywhere, frankly. And they have no prospect of ever being able to afford houses. What the hell has happened? Why is that situation tolerable? I find it extraordinary. But, capitalism is a very clever system. It has a million ways of adapting itself to make us think that this is okay. So, one of my favorite examples, I was part of the Occupy Wall Street protests in New York City way back, what was that, 2015 or something? No, it was earlier than that,
It
sorry.
was 2010, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, or 2011. Yeah.
yeah, I can't even remember. Isn't that awful? Anyway, soon after the protest began, it didn't take long for you to be able to buy Occupy t-shirts uptown in New York City, and Jay-Z had a special line of Occupy clothing. Capitalism appropriates the tools that are used against it. It realizes that people are starved of meaning, of agency. So it gives you the tools to think that you've got agency or meaning. You see a car advert that's all about a woman giving birth. Could anything be more meaningful than a woman giving birth? And yet actually they're trying to sell you a Volvo. And your experience of it is emotional, and you're drawn into it in some ghastly, cynical way that is appropriating our most intimate human experiences to sell us things. We are colonized. Our brains are colonized. Our bodies are colonized. We don't have control of
Mm.
either.
Well, there's a couple interesting things there, which is actually Jana and I were just talking about a book I'm reading at the moment called Scarcity Brain. I'm not sure if you've read it, but that is kind of all about that, how our brains are actually conditioned in this era, and how our actual brain chemistry has been changing due in a huge part to a lot of the effects of capitalism and this kind of constant desire to have more and do more, and triggering that kind of dopamine effect. But another kind of interesting point is that, you were making about is people thinking that the current forms of government we have are the end all and be all. And actually, if you look back, not even that long ago, to other civilizations and other dominant world powers, we have had many different forms of government. And, it's not so long ago that Italy was the Roman Empire, and that was a very different form of government. And so I guess since, in this, we like to think about how things could be different in the future, either for better or for worse. What kind of alternative forms of government do you think that we might look to in the future? And what are those future models of society that might come to pass, hoping that we don't end up in the kind of apathy Netflix soup that you mentioned?
Yeah, sure. Well, obviously it's hypothetical. Who knows? One of the things about the last few years is it's taken people like me who think about politics by surprise. I did think there was going to be authoritarianism as a result of the feeling of chaos and lack of control that capitalism creates in us, that a man would come along and say, I can control things, vote for me and I will be your voice. That is Trump all over. But what happens next? Not clear. I mean, I put it as two polar opposites. One is the kind of authoritarianism of China, Russia, and increasingly the US, of a population controlled by its government, where dissent is suppressed, political prisoners, etc., etc. That's one, I think, very serious possibility if we do nothing. I think that's coming, and I think liberal democracy is not strong enough to withstand that, because liberal democracy has got no answer to these fundamental flaws of agency and inequality that it has produced. An alternative, which I would like to see, is self-government. As you say, there is nothing immutable about the current system. There has been self-government, horizontal forms of participatory government in many different civilizations through history, arguably far more than our current system. Why on earth are we arrogant enough to think that our system is not going to change? Of course it's going to change. Something will replace it. And, I run around saying, well, we've got to replace it. If we don't do it, nobody will. It really is about seizing autonomy yourself, not just expecting this deus ex machina to come and create. Because I think, one of the things that liberal democracy and capitalism have done is create this incredible passivity, that change happens to us, that there's something immutable, some Hegelian dialectic that tick-tocks between thesis and antithesis to create the synthesis. And I don't think history works like that. History is a function of people's actions. And we actually now have the opportunity through technology to connect actions all over the world. And that's potentially very exciting. And I think change can happen very, very quickly all over the world. I mean, we saw it a bit in the Arab Spring, didn't go too well in the end, but you saw change going around the whole Arab region like a bolt of electricity, incredibly fast. There's an idea in complexity theory that when a system is primed for change, when it's at criticality, as it's known in complexity theory, all it takes is one little change in one part of the system for that change to spread across the whole system. So that's, another way of thinking that our change in our little piece of the carpet might actually trigger much broader change. I find that quite a hopeful idea.
You mentioned, the end of history earlier, and it's made me think quite a bit about that, Francis Fukuyama book, The End of History, which I'm sure was kind of what you were alluding to, and the notion that, we've ascended to the peak right now. It's liberal, democracy, capitalism, all the way. There's no turning back, and yet we've seen it turn back so quickly, or we've seen it mutate into whatever this is in the US, so very quickly. And similarly, you mentioned the Arab Spring, and you mentioned these like catalytic, things that start off almost as little ripples and then turn into waves that can be catalysts for massive change themselves. And I guess, you know, how does that change happen, both for the negative, as we're seeing in some major democracies at the moment, as well as for the positive in terms of um, overthrowing repressive regimes or returning to a more people-oriented form of government and society? What are those catalyzing factors, and how does that change happen?
Well, I think people have to be convinced that they have power, they have agency, that we are many and they are few, and that if we organise and act, we can build an alternative system from the bottom up. And I'm afraid many people don't believe that. I give talks about this, and people come up to me at the end and say, "What can I do?" And so I think I've totally failed in my talk, because people should be inspired to take action themselves. And I think many people just feel it's impossible. It's impossible for them to trigger change. Well, the right doesn't feel that. Donald Trump didn't think that. Nigel Farage's people don't think that. They think if they get organised and get the money, they can change everything. It's a very top-down model, and it's easier to imagine it in a top-down political system where through various devices you can dominate a top-down political system, through media, money, etc., etc. Clever social media, etc. The tools are quite clear. The tools of bottom-up social change are less clear. The archetypal examples are less clear in people's minds. But I am devoting my life to trying to spread knowledge about that possibility and that potential.
No, and I think that makes sense. And to be honest, I mean, Jana and I being in the sort of digital finance world, this is kind of echoing of decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, and giving agency back to people, which I think is really about the ethos at the beginning and the origins of crypto and the Bitcoin movement, obviously. And so this is familiar in a way, except applied much more broadly than just financial services, but to kind of all areas of life. So, but I want to end with a fun question, and I actually love that you left us on that hopeful note of actually it's down to us and the actions that we decide to take as individuals, not just now, but for the kind of far future. So let's think about a galactic civilization, or maybe not galactic, but system-wide civilization, if you prefer, just in our solar system. Do we think that that can exist? Do you think that can exist? And if so, what would the governance there look like in your kind of ideal future world where we are kind of independent, self-governing, and working towards that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a wonderful book called The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin that describes an anarchist society on a particular planet. There's two neighboring planets. One is anarchist and one is kind of capitalist. And in the capitalist one, they all dress very well, but in the anarchist one, they're kind of happier. Their clothes are not as fancy. I can't see how a consumerist capitalist society can survive colonizing other planets. The tools that people the tools that are used to satiate people, to make them feel satisfied with their lives, aren't going to be available if on Mars. There's going to have to be some other form or source of meaning and satisfaction. Maybe it's planting things, maybe it's artisanal crafts, I don't know, but I think a different kind of political system is going to be necessary. Again, it may be authoritarianism, I'm afraid to say. That may be the easy alternative that people choose rather than something more participatory. But as we discussed, I think technology does enable mass participatory democracy in a way that has never been possible before. So I think it's perfectly plausible that a more bottom-up, horizontal, shared culture, I mean, it's not just politics, it's also the economy, it's also society, that we center our relationships with each other rather than, consuming things because what is most important to us is each other. We exist in each other. Love, that's what clearly matters most to people. What does a society that centers love look like?
That is such an interesting idea and such a hopeful note to end on, but also, like, I actually do just want to come back to that quickly before we close out, which is I have actually never heard that, and we've had quite a few conversations about space. I've never heard that particular perspective before, which is that the motivations and the mechanisms for making people feel happy and fulfilled will be very different when we start to colonize other planets. And that is a really interesting point. Like, commodities will be scarcer, you won't have the same access to goods and services. It will, and maybe even if eventually we do, it will take a really long time. And so that's an absolutely fascinating point, and thank you for sharing that.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Khan. And to our dear listeners, you now have your recommended sci-fi reading of the week as well, The Dispossessed. But yes, thank you. That's been incredibly insightful. We could probably carry on for much longer, and we possibly will after we stop recording as well.
Thank you for having me.